The United Nations Security Council is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations and is charged with the maintenance of international peace and security, as well as accepting new members to the United Nations and approving any changes to its United Nations Charter. Its powers include the establishment of peacekeeping operations, the establishment of international sanctions, and the authorization of military action through Security Council resolutions. It is the only UN body with the authority to issue binding resolutions to member states. The Security Council held its first session on 17 January 1946. Like the UN as a whole, the Security Council was created following World War II to address the failings of another international organization, the League of Nations, in maintaining world peace. In its early decades, the body was largely paralyzed by the Cold War division between the US and USSR and their respective allies, though it authorized interventions in the Korean War and the Congo crisis and peacekeeping missions in the Suez Crisis, Cyprus, and West New Guinea. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, UN peacekeeping efforts increased dramatically in scale, and the Security Council authorized major military and peacekeeping missions in Kuwait, Namibia, Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Somalia, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Security Council consists of 15 members. The great powers that were the victors of World War II, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, China, and the United States, serve as the body's 5 permanent members. These permanent members can veto any substantive Security Council resolution, including those on the admission of new member states or candidates for Secretary General. The Security Council also has 10 non-permanent members, elected on a regional basis to serve 2-year terms. The body's presidency rotates monthly among its members. Critics of the Council often describe it as an undemocratic international body, and argue it fails its principal task, mainly because of the veto power of the permanent members. Security Council resolutions are typically enforced by UN peacekeepers, military forces voluntarily provided by member states and funded independently of the main UN budget. As of 2013, 116,837 peacekeeping soldiers and other personnel are deployed on 15 missions around the world. Evaluations of the Security Council's effectiveness are mixed, and calls for its reform predate the body's first meeting. However, little consensus exists on how its structure should be changed. History, background and creation. In the century prior to the UN's creation, several international treaty organizations and conferences had been formed to regulate conflicts between nations, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. Following the catastrophic loss of life in World War I, the Paris Peace Conference established the League of Nations to maintain harmony between the nations. This organization successfully resolved some territorial disputes and created international structures for areas such as postal mail, aviation, and opium control, some of which would later be absorbed into the UN. However, the League lacked representation for colonial peoples and significant participation from several major powers, including the US, USSR, Germany, and Japan. It failed to act against the 1931 Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War in 1935, the 1937 Japanese invasion of China, and German expansions under Adolf Hitler that culminated in World War II. The earliest concrete plan for a new world organization began under the aegis of the U.S. State Department in 1939. Roosevelt first coined the term United Nations to describe the Allied countries. On New Year's Day 1942, President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, Maxim Litvinov of the USSR, and T.V. Soong of China signed a short document which later came to be known as the United Nations Declaration, and the next day the representatives of 22 other nations added their signatures. The term United Nations was first officially used when 26 governments signed this declaration. By the 1st of March 1945, 21 additional states had signed. Four policemen was coined to refer four major Allied countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China, which was emerged in declaration by United Nations and became the foundation of an executive branch of United Nations, the Security Council. In mid-1944, the delegations from the Soviet Union, the UK, the US and China met for the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C., to negotiate the UN structure, and the composition of the UN Security Council quickly became the dominant issue. France, the Republic of China, the Soviet Union, the UK, and US were selected as permanent members of the Security Council. The US attempted to add Brazil as a sixth member, but was opposed by the heads of the Russian and British delegations. The most contentious issue at Dumbarton and in successive talks proved to be the veto rights of permanent members. The Soviet delegation argued that each nation should have an absolute veto that could block matters from even being discussed, while the British argued that nations should not be able to veto resolutions on disputes to which they were a party. At the Yalta Conference of February 1945, the American, British, and Russian delegations agreed that each of the Big Five could veto any action by the Council, but not procedural resolutions, meaning that the permanent members could not prevent debate on a resolution. On 25 April 1945, the UN Conference on International Organization began in San Francisco. It ended by 50 governments and a number of non-governmental organizations involved in drafting the United Nations Charter. At the conference, V. Avat of the Australian delegation pushed to further restrict the veto power of Security Council permanent members, due to the fear that rejecting this strong veto would cause the conference's failure. His proposal was defeated 20 votes to 10. The UN officially came into existence on 24 October 1945 upon ratification of the Charter by the 5 then permanent members of the Security Council, and by a majority of the other 46 signatories. On 17 January 1946, the Security Council met for the first time at Church House, Westminster, in London, England. Cold War. The Security Council was largely paralyzed in its early decades by the Cold War between the US and USSR and their allies, and the Council generally was only able to intervene in unrelated conflicts. In 1956, the first UN peacekeeping force was established to end the Suez Crisis. However, the UN was unable to intervene against the USSR's simultaneous invasion of Hungary following that country's revolution. Cold War divisions also paralyzed the Security Council's Military Staff Committee, which had been formed by Articles 45 to 47 of the UN Charter to oversee UN forces and create UN military bases. The committee continued to exist on paper, but largely abandoned its work in the mid-1950s. In 1960, the UN deployed the United Nations operation in the Congo, the largest military force of its early decades, to restore order to the breakaway state of Katanga, restoring it to the control of the Democratic Republic of the Congo by 1964. However, the Security Council found itself bypassed in favor of direct negotiations between the superpowers in some of the decade's larger conflicts, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Vietnam War, focusing instead on smaller conflicts without an immediate Cold War connection. The Security Council deployed the United Nations Temporary Executive Authority in West New Guinea in 1962 and the United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Cyprus in 1964, the latter of which would become one of the UN's longest-running peacekeeping missions. On 25 October 1971, over U.S. opposition but with the support of many Third World nations, the mainland Communist People's Republic of China was given the Chinese seats on the Security Council in place of the Republic of China that occupied Taiwan. The vote was widely seen as a sign of waning U.S. influence in the organization. With an increasing Third World presence and the failure of UN mediation in conflicts in the Middle East, Vietnam, and Kashmir, the UN increasingly shifted its attention to its ostensibly secondary goals of economic development and cultural exchange. By the 1970s, the UN budget for social and economic development was far greater than its budget for peacekeeping. Post-Cold War. After the Cold War, the UN saw a radical expansion in its peacekeeping duties, taking on more missions in 10 years' time than it had in its previous 4 decades. The UN negotiated an end to the Salvadoran Civil War, launched a successful peacekeeping mission in Namibia, and oversaw democratic elections in post-apartheid South Africa and post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia. In 1991, the Security Council demonstrated its renewed vigor by condemning the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on the same day of the attack, and later authorizing a U.S.-led coalition that successfully repulsed the Iraqis. Under-Secretary General Brian Urquhart later described the hopes raised by these successes as a false renaissance for the organization, given the more troubled missions that followed. Though the UN Charter had been written primarily to prevent aggression by one nation against another, in the early 1990s, the UN faced a number of simultaneous, serious crises within nations such as Somalia, Haiti, Mozambique, and the former Yugoslavia. The UN mission in Somalia was widely viewed as a failure after the U.S. withdrawal following casualties in the Battle of Mogadishu, and the UN mission to Bosnia faced worldwide ridicule for its indecisive and confused mission in the face of ethnic cleansing. In 1994, the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda failed to intervene in the Rwandan genocide in the face of Security Council indecision. In the late 1990s, UN-authorized international interventions took a wider variety of forms. The UN mission in the 1991–2002 Sierra Leone Civil War was supplemented by British Royal Marines, and the UN-authorized 2001 invasion of Afghanistan was overseen by NATO. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq despite failing to pass a UN Security Council resolution for authorization, prompting a new round of questioning of the organization's effectiveness. In the same decade, the Security Council intervened with peacekeepers in crises, including the war in Darfur in Sudan and the Kivu conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 2013, an internal review of UN actions in the final battles of the Sri Lankan Civil War in 2009 concluded that the organization had suffered systemic failure. In November-December 2014, Egypt presented a motion proposing an expansion of the NPT to include Israel and Iran. This proposal was due to increasing hostilities and destruction in the Middle East connected to the Syrian conflict as well as others. All members of the Security Council are signatory to the NPT. Role. The UN's role in international collective security is defined by the UN Charter, which authorizes the Security Council to investigate any situation threatening international peace, recommend procedures for peaceful resolution of a dispute, call upon other member nations to completely or partially interrupt economic relations as well as sea, air, postal, and radio communications, or to sever diplomatic relations, and enforce its decisions militarily, or by any means necessary. The Security Council also recommends the new Secretary-General to the General Assembly and recommends new states for admission as member states of the United Nations. The Security Council has traditionally interpreted its mandate as covering only military security. though U.S. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke controversially persuaded the body to pass a resolution on HIV/AIDS in Africa in 2000. Under Chapter 6 of the Charter, Pacific Settlement of Disputes, the Security Council may investigate any dispute or any situation which might lead to international friction or give rise to a dispute. The Council may recommend appropriate procedures or methods of adjustment, if it determines that the situation might endanger international peace and security. These recommendations are generally considered to not be binding, as they lack an enforcement mechanism. A minority of scholars, such as Stephen Zunes, have argued that resolutions made under Chapter 6 are still directives by the Security Council and differ only in that they do not have the same stringent enforcement options, such as the use of military force. Under Chapter 7, the Council has broader power to decide what measures are to be taken in situations involving threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, or acts of aggression. In such situations, the Council is not limited to recommendations but may take action, including the use of armed force, to maintain or restore international peace and security. This was the legal basis for UN armed action in Korea in 1950 during the Korean War and the use of coalition forces in Iraq and Kuwait in 1991 and Libya in 2011. Decisions taken under Chapter 7, such as economic sanctions, are binding on UN members. The Security Council is the only UN body with the authority to issue binding resolutions. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court recognizes that the Security Council has authority to refer cases to the court in which the court could not otherwise exercise jurisdiction. The Council exercised this power for the first time in March 2005, when it referred to the court the situation prevailing in Darfur since 1 July 2002. Since Sudan is not a party to the Rome Statute, the court could not otherwise have exercised jurisdiction. The Security Council made its second such referral in February 2011 when it asked the ICC to investigate the Libyan government's violent response to the Libyan civil war. Security Council Resolution 1674, adopted on 28 April 2006. Reaffirms the provisions of paragraphs 138 and 139 of the 2005 World Summit Outcome document regarding the responsibility to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. The Security Council reaffirmed this responsibility to protect in Resolution 1706 on 31 August of that year. These resolutions commit the Security Council to take action to protect civilians in an armed conflict, including taking action against genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity.